So let's get to another topic as we're moving through this and coming to one of my favorite ones, and that's the constellations. Now, this is a fun one for me. I remember back in the 1990s being with my youth group that I was doing in a church in northern Illinois and going out in the night sky and pointing out certain constellations. I've also, when I was teaching with a private Christian school, I did the same thing. Took the students outside in the evening and we pointed out certain constellations and teaching the constellations. And I've done this in the North Woods at a Christian camp with telescopes and things because I love this one. I had a course in navigation, so I love to notice the star constellations and things like this. And I've been lost actually in the past. One time when I was in college, I got really lost. And on a night sky, there was no moon, but I could see the constellations. And I was in a forested area. I finally got to a clearing. I had no idea which way was north, south, east, and west. I was so confused in the dark of the forest because it was so dark you couldn't hardly see the trees. But we got to a clearing, and by looking at the clearing, I could see the constellations. And I was like, okay, I know which direction now we have to walk to get back to where our car is parked. And we started walking in that direction and just kept walking in that direction, and sure enough we finally came to the car. I was about a mile away from it, but we got back to it. And so you can use constellations for navigation, which is what I love, but we often associate the names of the constellations with Greek mythology, do we not? I mean, think about the constellation names. You have such names in the Northern Hemisphere as Cassiopeia, or Cassiopeia if you wish, Pegasus, Gemini, Andromeda, Cephus, Pleiades. And if you study Greek mythology, which when I was in high school it was required, we always had to read books on Greek mythology for some odd reason, and as studying the Greek mythologies, all these names are very common names. So a lot of people just associate the constellations came from the Greeks. Well, it's not quite right. Let me show you something fascinating. Claudius Ptolemy, here we are again, in 140 AD, came up with the idea, and actually in a star catalog that he put together called the Almagest is the name of the star catalog. He lists the different constellations. He draws the constellations and he gives them Greek names. Now remember, this is a book that is used for centuries then in all academia. So we associate these names of constellations from this book written in the 2nd century AD by Ptolemy. That's where we get this association with the Greeks to this. Because, let me prove it to you, the Greeks are not the ones who came up with the constellations. I actually sat through a class with a Harvard professor of astronomy. I can't remember his name, but I logged into, I was given a free chance to sit in a lecture listening to astronomy on this, and he actually stated this in the lecture. And this is from Harvard. This professor, boy, I can't think of his name, but he was actually teaching that the constellations, and that's why I found this fascinating, because the lecture title was about the names of the constellations, and he was saying it's not associated with the Greeks. It actually goes back even to the Bible periods and possibly to the Hebrew. And I was like, whoa, this is cool. Well, getting ahead of myself here. During the Age of Discovery, the constellations, I'm talking about the discovery with the Portuguese going out, da Gama, Magellan, and all these other explorers going out in the Age of Discovery, 1500s, 1600s, and stuff like this. They started moving to the south below the equator, and they started saying, wow, there's lots of constellations here. So we start giving them names too. But they discovered that there's constellations, as we talked about already, below the equator and some above the equator, of course. Now, for instance, when the Dutch began sailing below the equator in the 1500s, they discovered there's totally new constellations there. And they gave them names. Some of their famous ones on the southern constellations are Apis, Grus, Dorado. Now, those are not necessarily Greek, but you can see that there's different names put to constellations by these explorers that were studying this. You get to the next century, there's a Polish astronomer who named 10 more constellations in the southern hemisphere. A couple of them, Scrutum, Lynx was another one. And in the 1700s, there's a French astronomer who names even more constellations. See, we keep discovering constellations and giving them names. He called two famous ones, Microscopium and Telescopium. How about those for names? Those aren't Greek either. Not all constellations come from the Greeks, is the point I'm trying to make here. Those familiar in the northern hemisphere, we just often assume the Greeks named everything. But it's not true. They borrowed names from another culture. What does the Bible, though, contain about this? What does the Bible say about the constellation names? Do you know that there are actually constellations mentioned in the Bible of the northern hemisphere? And the Hebrew nation had these way before the Greek Empire ever existed, before the Greeks were even the Greeks. Constellations had names to them, and the same names as what you see that we use today are also found in the Bible. History dictates that it was during the dark ages of ancient Greece, that would be around the period of 1200 to 800 BC, is when the Greeks came up with their idea of their mythology. Actually, they just borrowed gods and stuff from other cultures. The Canaanites, the Egyptians gave them different names. Then the Romans did the same thing. But they took they developed their mythology, the religion, if you want to call it that, between 1200 and 800 BC. And then, and we have these names of gods, you know, Hercules, Pegasus, we have Cephas, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, etc., etc. And they come up with these names then. And so they give these names to these constellations. That's what happened. But long before this, before 1200 BC, before the Greeks even started beginning to think about this, you have the oldest book, which we mentioned, is the book of Job. And Job, considering the oldest book ever written, dating back to the time possibly before Abraham, that would be over 2000 BC. Do you know that Job mentions 3 constellations by name? Take a look at Job chapter 9, verse 9. You're going to be amazed at what you're going to read here if you've never studied this before. This will blow your socks off because it says, "Who makes the bear, Orion, and the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south?" Wait a minute, we didn't even know there were constellations in the south. But yeah, how about that? How do we know this? Now remember, Job just didn't get up one day and just start writing a book. This is the Holy Spirit speaking to him and telling him to write things. But the thing is, people at the time of Job were calling these constellations certain names. One of them was called the Bear, one was called the Orion, another one's called the Pleiades. Sound familiar? Isn't that fascinating? And that's not the only place. You go to Job chapter 38, verse 1, you're going to see another one, 2 of these mentioned. It says, "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion?" Here again, we have Pleiades and Orion. Wait a minute. Are you catching this? This is so exciting. Constellations we associate with the Greeks around 800 BC. Those names existed around 2000 BC, before the Greeks. And if you go to different cultures and study ancient cultures all over the world, you'll often find that they call Orion the hunter. The Big Dipper we often call the bear. And they call the Pleiades like 7 sisters, or 7 people, or something like this. We have these names. How do they get these names? How did all the cultures scattered all over the world come to call these things the same name? If you go over to North America, now remember, we're talking, this was in the Middle East, a lot of these things were written and stuff. But in North America, the Native Americans actually called the Big Dipper, we commonly called it Big Dipper, they called it the bear. Many tribes called it that. They had Orion listed as the hunter. How did they do these things? See, something's not right if we just think that all these constellation names came from the Greeks. Something's not making sense here. The bear, Orion, and Pleiades, seemingly based on Greek mythology, no. I mean, today, yes, you can take the Greek thing because that was added later on by Ptolemy. But if the Greeks invented the names of the constellations based on their religion, how come then the Hebrew people had these names centuries before? There's a problem here. How could the Hebrews have these names, the same names, centuries before the Greeks ever came around? And, it's just not the book of Job. Go to the book of Amos, one of the minor prophets. Amos lived around 750, 760 BC. He records 2 constellations. Which ones? Amos chapter 5, verse 8. Look what it says. "He who made the Pleiades and Orion, Here again, we have two constellations. Now, yes, this one is actually after the Greek nation has developed them. This is 760 BC, so that has happened. But the thing is, how did the Hebrew people get these? Why would the Hebrew be using names if they're associated with the Greeks, Greek gods? They wouldn't. Something's not right here. So, to answer this is just very close to the time of Greeks that Amos is writing this, but why does Job and Amos, why do they have this in here? What's it indicate? This is what I got from that lecture from the Harvard professor. He said the first origin of the constellations was not Greek. He flat out said that right in the lecture, which I already knew that because in studying the Bible, I knew it couldn't be. He said that it was even before the Hebrews or even the Egyptians. Now, the Hebrew nation started with Abraham. That's about 2000 BC. Job is before that. Almost all Bible scholars will place Job before Abraham. That fits very well with this, that these constellations were actually called that 2000 BC and before that. So we're starting to see something going on here. Second point here. Since the names of three constellations are mentioned in Job, a book written much earlier than the Greek religion, it's got to be assumed that these names did not originate with the Greeks. There's no way. Third, there are possible links to these constellations in the Hebrew teaching that used the constellations in the foretelling of the coming Messiah. There have been a couple of very interesting books written about this. We'll come to that in a second. But a fourth thing, many cultures all over the ancient world, like I said, have similar names to the constellations that existed prior to the Greeks. What this is showing, if you haven't caught it yet, is at one time, since all these nations all over the world called these constellations, these constellation names, or a similar name to it, that these constellations having the same name, that gives evidence that the world at one time must have spoke a common language because everybody had the same names. Now, if they all spoke a common language, if everybody in the world had the same language and they called these things these different names, then all of a sudden they get scattered and they carry these names with them into their own cultures, and as later on, like with the Greeks, they put their mythology to it, but they still carry the same names. Now, is there any time in the Bible that talks about something like this possibly happening? Yes, in the book of Genesis, the story of the Tower of Babel. Many scholars believe, and this is what this professor was actually, he mentioned in his lecture. Now, he didn't come flat out and say that this is the way it is, but he did say this is quite possible, that the constellation stories were all made before the Tower of Babel, when the world spoke a common language. And when people spoke this language, they all called these the same thing. Then, according to the biblical timeline, Babel, the Tower of Babel story would have taken place somewhere probably around 2000 BC. The people are scattered. As they scattered, they take the names with them. So according to the Bible, the people scattered takes the names to the forms of different nations, takes them to new geographic locations, but they keep the names of the constellations. Isn't this fascinating? Wow. And like I say, listening to a Harvard professor talk about this just blew my mind. The story of the Tower of Babel goes back to Genesis 11, the first 9 verses. Take a look. This is out of the English Standard again. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Move down a little bit. It says, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Isn't it amazing? All civilizations at one time spoke one language. Thus they would have had the same names of the constellations. Yet, when they get scattered, they still carried the constellation names, and it goes back even to the ancient Hebrew. Fascinating, isn't it? The constellations sort of point to the Bible's story of the Tower of Babel as being true. Isn't that interesting? I love talking about this in the night sky and pointing out the constellations and telling them, no, it's not the Greeks necessarily. Now, I mentioned a point, I told you I'd come back to it. During the 19th century, there was a movement started by a couple of Christian ministers who put forth a theory that before the Bible was actually all written down, like possibly at the time of Abraham or at the time of the Tower of Babel, maybe even before the time of the Tower of Babel, that God early, before the scriptures existed, he put the constellations in the night sky, gave them names, and gave them stories to prophesize the coming of the Messiah. There are a couple of different books that are written like that. Many books that are like that on the View. You don't see them as bestsellers too often, but here's one. This one here was given me by a great Bible preaching man named Truman Robertson, who started Fort Wilderness and a couple of other camps. But he gave me this, The Gospel in the Stars. And it's by Joseph Seiss. Also, I have another book, The Witness of the Stars by E.W. Bullinger. Both these books are basically saying the same thing. What they proclaim in them are that the constellations were given to mankind before the Tower of Babel, and it contains the story of the Messiah, how the Jews would know the Messiah. So popular books, like I say, they originated a while ago. They're modern books. Now, according to this theory, according to these books, Orion the hunter, to the Greeks, he's called the hunter, represents the Messiah. The Pleiades, who to the Greek are the group of the seven sisters, in this book is and also because the Pleiades occur inside, they're inside the constellation called Taurus, the bull. According to these books, Taurus represents God as a judge to the Jews and how the Messiah will judge mankind. And you have the seven stars of the Pleiades representing a group of those who are saved and not judged. And they are immortal and represent those who are the redeemed of the Messiah. And so this goes on and on. There's all sorts of things. For instance, Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, what we commonly call the Big Dipper, is not actually an animal. It's a sheepfold with a doorway, a gate, being like the tail. And that's where the lambs go in the sheep gate. And remember, Hebrews had a lot of occupation with sheep and shepherding. The sheep go into that fold, and the gate is closed. The tail, or the handle, is the gate that keeps the lambs inside. Thus, to the Jews will find a resting place inside the flock of God. It's stories like this that go on and on. On an interesting note, just also, and it talks about this, but this is also found in some astronomy books. If you take a look at that Big Dipper, or the bear, they used to use this in ancient times as an eye test. The last two stars in the handle of the bear are two stars called Miser and Alcor. But it's two stars. The second to the last star in the handle looks, at first glance, it's one star, but it's actually two stars. They're not even close to each other. They're light years apart. Miser and Alcor. And they used to use this as an eye test. Then can you see two stars? And if you look at it carefully, you will be able to distinguish, if you have really good eyesight, 20/20 vision, you'll be able to distinguish, if you stare at it, there are two stars there. It's not one star. By the way, the word miser means guarded or enclosed place. Alcor actually means lamb. So you see, there's some of these constellation names you can easily draw that they possibly have to do with this whole Messiah and biblical story. Now, is this true? Is this what this happens? Well, these books were written, like I say, just a little over 100 years ago. Two different pastors wrote these things. There's been some other books like this and ideas and stuff. But whether that's how this is put together and stuff, I don't know. Another fascinating thing, though, about that last one, about Ursa Major, the bear, if we use that to figure out where the Little Dipper is. If you take the part of the cup and you go straight off the end of the cup, it'll point you directly to the Little Dipper, which pours into the Big Dipper. But there's something else. In this book, I talk about this, that the handle, two stars of the handle, make a straight line to another constellation called Boötus. And that is actually, according to these ideas, that's the shepherd or the Messiah. Fascinating stories. Fascinating ideas. Are they real? Is this true? Well, most Christian scholars and astronomers dismiss this. They say it's more of a modern take of the messianic story that we have from the Bible, and they've put to the constellations. In a way, sort of like what the Greeks did with the constellation names. They took the names and added the religion to the constellations. Most scholars believe that's what's happening here. It's a storyline where they take the story of the Messiah from the Gospels and they put it to the constellations. Now, very well, that possibly is the answer to that. But what I do find interesting, and I have used this, I have actually pointed people using the constellations in the night skies, telling them stories like this. I personally, I think this is a modern take. But I have used this for evangelizing non-Christians and showing the story of the Messiah just by using the stars of the constellation. You can do that. You can, if you study these books, you can actually do the whole messianic story of Jesus being the Messiah and being victorious over evil and redeeming those who are lost, et cetera, and protecting them. It's fascinating stuff, but I believe it's just like what the Greeks did with their religion in the constellations. I think these modern pastors have sort of taken this idea, because I've checked as far back as I can. I cannot find any evidence going back into ancient time of the Jews having this type of a story. But we've come to the end of this study. What we've seen is the Bible does have many things having to do with the science of astronomy. And what we have found also, the Bible is absolutely correct. There's no contradictions. There's no errors in the Bible. When you study the biblical writings carefully, going back to the original languages and stuff, you start to see that what is in the Bible is true. Science constantly changes. Science is constantly making errors and having to correct itself. As I said at the very introduction of this thing, this is truth, written by a God who over 79 times in here refers to himself as a proper name called truth. God is a God of truth. There is truth here. Science disagrees, as we've been seeing in the series. Science disagrees and will say the Bible's wrong for centuries. But what usually, always comes out in the end, this is true. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this series. I've so enjoyed having you come along. We have other ones that are coming up in the series yet, and I hope you'll enjoy watching those and getting into it. And I hope you're using your Bible as you study this and make little notes and things in here too, so that you can tell other people about these things. I'd love for you to share our website or our Facebook page with others. But I want to thank you so much for joining us as we've done this little series here today. And until we meet again, take care and God bless.